The first sound Judith ever trusted was water working. Before the sun lifted its lid off the marsh, she knew the creek by its temper, the way it gargled under pluff grass, shouldered pilings, briefly forgot itself in the millpond, then hurried again through the race to the wheel. She rose before the rooster, on purpose, and listened from the stoop of the cookhouse, chalking the earthen world into measures, the thud of damped firewood, the sigh of rice straw, the trilling patience of tree frogs fading to daylight. When the wheels started turning, the paddles bit like teeth into the morning. Work had a music. She kept her hands inside that music, fingers raw from sacks, forearms gritted with meal. Judith counted by feel the rhythm of labor, the pull, the knot, the lift, until counting became thinking, and thinking became a rope thrown over some invisible beam of herself. She took hold, and she did not let go. And because she had learned, quietly, how letters stitched together like knots, how they could bind a thought so it would not float away, she sometimes shaped prayers in her head like lines of script she would never dare put to paper where anyone might find them. On that first morning the summer heat showed its teeth. She was 17 and thin the way a drawn bow is thin. The master had guests coming by boat from town, and the mill would need to sing all day. The cookhouse would steam and bellow, the yard would be picked clean, and the big house would pin itself like a white moth to the hill, fluttering with preparations. Judith's task, as the driver had assigned it, was to manage the flow with the sluice, open by hand before first light, ease it back when the water grew impatient, and close it to a knife edge when the millstones needed to rest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. The gate lever was a long timber blackened by weather and by touch. Judith braced a bare foot on the beam and leaned with her whole weight, feeling the pond tug against her through the wood like an animal working a halter. The iron ratchet clicked, water surged, the wheel coughed, then found its turn and began, plank by plank, to swallow the creek in bites. She smelled mud lift and lay down again, smelled the tannin in the pond, the sweet rot of marsh hay, the pith of cut pine from the repairs she had begged to do herself when a tooth broke from the wheel in spring. Begged was the outward word. Inward she had offered knowledge. The wheel had split because the dowel was green when it was set. She said as much, eyes down. She asked to fetch a seasoned beam from the shed, a brace of chisels, the mallet. She said she could shape the tooth herself, and the driver, amused by her nerve, let her try. 2 hours later, a wet-throated thunder came out of the race again, the wheel turning sure as a heart, and Judith, who did not smile where anyone could see it, smiled to the pond. Now the same water slid past her calves where she stood in the shallows, hem-pinned. The world was layers, sky slag gray on the horizon, then lifting to pewter blue. The pond a lid of glass blotted with duckweed. Below that, darker water writing and rewriting itself. Below that, mud and the clean bones of palmetto roots. She knew this pond the way a person knows a face they are not allowed to touch. She knew where the bottom fell sudden away near the old cypress snag, where the bank undercut itself in a soft mouth that could take a foot and keep it, where the mill's tail race bit like a small, steady animal at anything foolish enough to swim near it. Judith did not swim. She waded when she had to. She spoke to water in the language of gates and sluices and careful rope, and in return the water taught her what moved even when everybody said it could not. This exchange felt like reading, like the days she crept up to the loft above the smokehouse to copy letters with a dull nail into the smooth side of barrel staves. When she first traced a J, her own initial, she understood that a sound could stand up. When she made the letters small and neat, she understood that a voice could be kept quiet but alive. Her mother had taught her hymns and seasonings and the art of knowing when to lift the pot lid and when to leave it. Her mother had carried iron pots and babies through summers that blistered like kiln-fired clay. Her mother now slept in a corner of the colored burying ground behind the mill, the grave marked by a cluster of stones set in a cross no one white would notice. She visited at night. She told her mother everything she could not say in daylight, and sometimes she traced letters onto the stones with her fingertip. M-A-E. It was not her mother's name, not the one the ledgers had taken, but the one that had curled out of her mother's own mouth undersong when the pain was a tide that kept coming. May. The master's name was Harlan Wexley. He was not old, not yet, but he carried himself like his own father's ghost, hand on hip, the other hand on a hickory cane, mouth perpetually bored with other people's breath. He liked the mill because men in town liked to watch it, and because planters upriver envied the steadiness of his wheel, which, thanks to Judith's obstinate care, almost never failed even when the creek sulked. He liked the pond at dusk because his reflection on its black surface looked like a portrait he would pay a painter for in town. A man of property, clean lines, the hill behind him gathered like a silvered quilt. Judith had once seen him stand long on the bank with his hands folded behind him, as if the pond would read him back to himself and find nothing wanting.
He did not see Judith. He saw a body moving sacks, a head bent to the lever, a pair of good hands useful the way a knife is useful. He used what he had purchasable language for. The rest he ignored. This was a kind of mercy. It was also the hinge on which the future might swing. Judith understood that her invisibility could be a garment she wore, tight and hot in summer, but edged with pockets big enough to hide a plan. She had not yet named the plan in her head on that first morning, but it waited in her with the patience water has when it goes to ground and keeps moving there. By noon, the yard was a bright slap of heat. The marsh had gone bluer. Dragonflies worked the air like small needle-nosed angels, stitching the day shut. Judith's shift stuck to her shoulder blades, and every grain of meal she spilled on her wrists turned to paste. She kept the sluice at a careful throat aflow, while Sam, bare-shouldered, scar-stitched, older than anyone could place, worked the millstones with the lover's attention, and Yaya lifted and dropped the rice with the rhythm that made a song of the dust. "Ease," Sam called, when the wheel labored. Judith eased. "Give," when the stones hummed to a thin whine, she gave. "Close," when the boat from town unexpectedly came fast across the pond, throwing a wake that slapped the race and made the wheel shudder. She closed to a notch, the ratchet chirping like a scold, then opened again when the water found its measure. Harlan Wexley's guests disembarked in coats unsuited to the air, smelling faintly of winter camphor, though the day smelled of swamp and pine. They were all talk, and their talk was a flat river skimming over all the boulders underneath. Judith heard more than the words, the way a person who can read hears more than the voice reading to them. She heard the compliment inside the complaint when one planter griped about the unreliability of hired millwrights upriver. She heard the fear inside the joke when another spoke airily of a rumored cholera case in town. She heard how Wexley needed them to admire him for things that were not his to admire for. In the cookhouse, Miss Liza, the head cook and undisputed queen of iron, pointed with a chin and sent Judith for herbs, then onions, then the good salt kept in a jar above the hearth. Liza's authority was a wind that filled the room. When she spoke, even the fire listened. She had a scar on her cheek that glowed like a small moon when she flushed with heat. 2 years ago, Liza had pressed a slice of onion onto the raw welt on Judith's back and said in her usual unimpressed voice, "It will take the sting out and bring the bad out. Hold still." Judith had held still. Liza had cried without changing her face. Judith had memorized the fact that kindness sometimes wore its sternest dress in order to survive. Girl, Liza said now, not unkind. When you're done with that sluice, you wash, you come help till evening. They want a white sauce. They think milk and flour is magic. We will give them magic. Yes, ma'am, Judith said, which was the safer word in daylight for the respect she meant. At the table laid out in the shade, Wexley laughed too loudly and gestured too often with the cane. He liked to balance the cane tip on one toe and spin the handle under his palm. On days when he imagined himself gentle, I saw him do this. On other days, the cane was a line drawn in air that his body simply followed down, quick as lightning, and the person in its way learned to step aside in the future, if there was a future for them to learn in. The day lengthened like an iron bar heated and drawn. The wheel kept time. Judith's mind, always counting, cut the hours into work and lessons. 6 turns of the ratchet, a measure of flour sifted, 2 onions chopped to invisibility in Liza's pan, 10 breaths to walk from sluice to cookhouse, 13 to listen at the door of the smokehouse for Miss Ruth, who taught letters when she could get away from the quarters with a scrap of paper and a bit of charcoal.
Ruth's husband shipped timber down the river under the cover of night, sometimes for coin he hid in hollowed-out fence posts. He had told Ruth once, foolish, tender man, that if he could ever pay the right person enough, he would buy a paper that said free and put Ruth's name on it. Ruth had laughed, not unkind. Paper, she said, is a voice they taught to talk. I can give myself that much of a voice without a white man's stamp. She taught Judith the same way Liza taught sauces, with power linted from the everyday, patient as rising dough. Write me the word water, Ruth had whispered 2 nights before, drawing the strokes with her forefinger into Judith's palm. The letters had tingled like electricity, if such a word had been available to them, and Judith, eyes closed, had written into Ruth's hand in return. The word stuck in her now, as cool as the shade under the mill's sill beam. Water. All her plans would have to honor water's nature. It rushed where the world sloped. It wore stones smooth. It remembered every touch. When the guests had eaten and were lazy with praise, they aimed at one another more than at Liza's table. When the yard was a rectangle of sun slowly tipping, when even the herons looked like paper cutouts against the glittering marsh, Judith stepped back to the sluice to slow the world. "Close her," Sam called. "Let her breathe." Judith fit her shoulder to the lever and leaned. The ratchet told the gate to mind itself. The water obeyed in degrees, grudging as any creature asked to stop what it was born for. The wheels slowed, each paddle lifting from the race with a sound like a hand leaving wet skin. Then stillness took the machine, and in that sudden quiet, Judith could hear the pond's edge telling secrets, the murmurs of small lives in grass, the gloop of a frog taking its ridiculous leap. She felt a gaze, not the ordinary swarm of glances that lighted on her the way flies briefly lit on everything, something heavier. She turned. One of Wexley's guests stood half in shadow near the tool shed, a man with a yellow handkerchief jauntily tied at his throat as if the heat were a game he intended to win. He had the look of a town acquaintance, a man comfortable with chairs that had never traveled over rough ground, with streets that did not change their minds twice a day like the creek. He smiled at Judith the way men smiled at meat just before carving. "What's your name, girl?" he asked. Judith looked at the rivet head on the sluice lever instead of at him. "They call me Judith." "They," the man repeated, as if that could be a joke. "Judith." He rolled the name in his mouth and swallowed it like a sip of something he believed was his by right. "How old?" "Old enough to work," she said, which was a truth-permitted speech. He laughed to himself. "Harlan," he called toward the table, "you didn't tell me you had a beauty working your mill." Judith did not change her face. She changed the temperature of herself, the way she had learned to do around fire, 1 degree colder at a time, quietly. She did not step away from the lever and did not step toward the cookhouse. She stayed where her body was useful and where her tools were within reach. Wexley stood, cane in hand. He came down the bank at an angle that said he owned the bend in his knees. "She's quick with the gait," he said, without warmth. He spoke to the guest, but with an eye like a small, measuring blade turned toward Judith. "Quicker than most. I have mine to get her on the wheel proper, but Sam's jealous of his wheel." He smiled at Sam, who looked at a point 6 inches above Wexley's head and did not blink. The guest strolled closer. "You ever been to town, Judith?" "No, sir," she said. The "sir" was a lid on boiling. He said, as if he could imagine her in a hat shop instead of here, or perhaps in a room upstairs somewhere with a door that locked on his side. He asked Reed suddenly, with that careless meanness some men enjoy when they bring a boot down on a small animal just to feel the power of the muscles under leather. "No, sir," Judith said, and turned the lever 2 notches, closing the gate to a finish. The wheel ceased entirely. For a moment there was just the pond holding the sky, and the men holding their words, and Judith holding herself. That night, Judith washed meal from her arms and braided her hair tight and lay on her pallet and pretended to sleep. When the deep breathing around her settled into the night's patience, she slid from under the quilt and crept out by the path the moon had made. She went not to the burying ground, but to the mill. The pond at night was an eye closed. The wheel looked like the rib cage of a great animal that had laid itself down to rest. Moths bumped the lantern she dared not light. In the dark, Judith went by touch. She found the coil of rope behind the grain bins and counted the knots she and Yahya had tied into it 2 nights past when the thought that had been only a seed at the back of her brain cracked and put out a pale root. "Not yet," Yahya had said then, sitting with his back to the warm bulk of the mill. "It's not ripe." "It's ripening," Judith had said. "If we wait, it will rot on the stalk." He had turned his face toward her voice. He trusted her, knew the weight of her words the way you know the weight of a good hammer in your hand. He was a man made of patience. He would never move until moving was the only thing left to do. It steadied Judith to stand in his weather. But in the mill's ribs that night, she felt time tapping her shoulder. You don't know when men in coats will come. You don't know when the wrong name will be said to the wrong ear. You don't know when the cane will swing down. She uncoiled the rope. She ran it through her hand to feel for frayed places. She measured in the dark the distance from the sluice lever to the post where she could belay it, and from there to the second post she had driven into the damp ground with the back of an axe and a prayer no one had heard over the frogs. Water would do what water does. If the gate were closed sudden and hard on a man leaning over to watch his own face in the pond, the pull of the race might vanish under him like a trick of light and send him forward half a step he wasn't counting on. If the bank where the old cypress roots made a slick braid were wet, if the evening had lately spat a small rain, if a hand were to loosen his ankle from his boot heel at just the right moment, it would look like the pond had called him down for a closer conversation. Judith's mouth went dry thinking it. Not with fear only, also with the thirst she did not have language for. She was not blood-hungry. The idea of the master's body flailing was almost more than she could stomach. But the idea of an end to the daily calibrated humiliation, the cutting of the tether so that her thoughts might stand up in daylight and go where they pleased, made her tongue cleave to the roof of her mouth like a person trying not to cry. "You want to do it clean," She whispered to the wheel, to the water, to the moths batting their dumb hope against the lantern she held unlit. Clean means the world did it. Clean means we were only what we always are, hands on tools, watching the flow. The rope whispered in her fingers like a word someone wants you to say again. In the morning, Yaya looked at the sky, and at the pond's face, and at Judith's face. He said nothing in the yard, but when he came to the mill to hoist sacks with her, he said, "Say the day." 2 days, she said. Dusk. He nodded. Dusk forgives a lot. Dusk hides a lot, she corrected, but smiled with her eyes so he'd understand, and he did. The next hours were an inventory of ordinary. Liza sent Judith and Ruth to shell peas under the oak, and their fingers made green sound while their mouths made quiet. Sam told stories only he could laugh at, and laughed hard enough for two, which was his way of watering the roots of the people he had adopted as kin. The children carried sticks as if they were rifles, and marched circles around the smokehouse until Liza snapped her dish tile and sent them into shrieks and dispersal. The wheel turned and turned, and the creek gave itself to the paddle, as if it could never do anything differently. Judith read when she could. A scrap of newspaper someone had wrapped bacon in, grease creeping into the letters like a fog. She read around the stains to find words about a war in a country she would never see, about a woman in Boston whose bonnet was described as if it were a relative of hers. Judith found herself both irritated and hungry for those words. It was not the Boston lady she wanted. It was the fact of the sentence being permitted to exist. It was the sensation of something inside her unfurling like paper taken out of a hidden drawer. 2 days passed slowly when a plan is a damp match you keep near your heart. By the second afternoon, the air tasted of iron and thunder. Small clouds had been gathering all day like white cattle. Now they turned gray and skittish and hurried toward one another. Liza sniffed at the door of the cookhouse and said to the sky, "Be decent." The sky considered. Judith walked the pond bank and made small adjustments no one seeing would call anything but tidiness. She cleared the mat of duckweed near the cypress snag with a crooked branch, making a darker oval that read like deeper water to the eye. She scuffed the bank where the undercut made its mouth, then patted the scuff smooth so it looked like the day had done it. She counted her breaths to slow her racing heart and realized the counting had become prayer without her permission. When Wexley's boat returned from town, it had gone in at noon to fetch a bolt of cloth his wife wanted. It returned with the cloth and a bottle of town gossip. The man with the yellow handkerchief was again in the bow, one hand on the gunwale, the other on his hat. He had a way of opening his legs when he stood that made the world look like a thing spread for him. Judith fixed her gaze at a knot in the boathouse pilings and did not look up as the men stepped onto the dock. Her ears sifted their words like grain, useless chaff flying, a few hard seeds dropping ringing into the bin. Trial, someone said. Escape, someone else. Conspiracy, a third voice breathed, as if the word itself were a thing he both feared and craved. Liza met Judith's eye across the yard. It was not fear in Liza's face. It was what happens to steel when it is tempered, something bending in an exquisite way toward its purpose. At dusk, the pond turned to polished pewter. The first raindrops were fat and few, each one making a small mouth in the water that opened and closed with a sound like kissing. Frogs tuned their instruments. The air, which had been holding its breath all afternoon, let it out in a soft, relieved exhale that lifted the little hairs at the back of Judith's neck as if someone had breathed there.
She stood at the sluice. Yaya stood at the second post, charged with the rope's clean belay. Sam, who had thought himself too old to be part of anything except the stories about how it was in his youth, stood at the corner of the mill where he could, if needed, bump the tail race gate with his hip and change the pull of the water by a hair's breadth. Ruth stood farther up the bank with a basket of nothing in her hands, which made her look like any woman walking at dusk thinking of nothing more than whether she had enough salt.
They did not talk. They breathed as one animal. Wexley came down with his cane, bored with his own house, drawn as always by the pond's mirror. The man with the yellow handkerchief walked half a step behind him, the way a dog walks with a man who gives it meat and sometimes a kick. "Wheel ran smooth today," Wexley said to nobody and everybody, which meant himself. "That girl's got a knack." He did not look at Judith when he said girl, as if saying it were patting her on the head. Judith looked at the lever's grain. The wood had a scar where an old nail had been pulled and the hole whittled closed. She put her thumb there. She could feel through the wood the press of water on the gate like a palm on the other side of a door. "You can see your nose hairs in that pond," the yellow handkerchief man said, joking without laughter, and bent to look as if he had made it so by saying. His boot heel slid half a finger in the scuffed earth, but he caught himself, because he was not yet drunk and his body knew its balance. "Careful," Wexley said, and his voice had the sweetness of a man who loves nothing so much as the idea that he has warned you, so that if you fall, he can be innocent. Judith's heart beat a crooked drum pattern, terrible in its beauty. She looked once at Yaya. His hands were loose on the rope, the way a fisherman's are loose before the net takes the weight of the river. The first true sheet of rain came then, sudden and decent, making the pond's face prickle and go dark. It softened the bank in a single breath. It laced the air between Judith and the men with silver threads that would look like nothing at all to anyone peering later, trying to see what they had not wanted to see. Wexley said, stepping closer to the water as if to put his hat brim between the pond and the sky. "Damn weather." Judith turned the lever one tooth. Yaya took the slack. The race answered the gate's small change with a change of its own, a tug at the wheel, a hush where there had been a mutter. The pond, obedient to plumbing and gravity, shifted its muscle under the surface. Where the undercut was, a mouth opened a little wider. Ruth lifted her basket and pretended to inspect the emptiness inside. Sam blew his nose loudly and said, "Old bones," as if the ache of his knees were the only thunder he cared to name. Wexley bent. His reflection broke into black coins. The yellow handkerchief man reached to clap his shoulder and ended up clapping air. Judith breathed once. She felt Julia, no, she checked herself, felt Judith, her own name, stand up inside her, as if until then she had been crouched to make herself smaller. She put her shoulder to the lever. The ratchet ticked once, twice. The pond moved. The bank gave like bread just pulled. Wexley's foot slid, his cane stabbed and hit nothing. He said the beginning of a word, now, perhaps, or no, and then he was a man in a suit, talking to water with his mouth full. Judith did not watch his face. She watched what she had made. The line of the rope in Yaya's hands, the set of the gate, the slight tremor in the wheel where the race took its new instruction. She watched the place where the cypress roots made their old slippery braid. She watched the surface where a hat went floating, ridiculous and neat. The yellow handkerchief man shouted and reached. The rain turned his shout into a private noise between him and his fear. He put his foot where Wexley had put his, because that is how certain kinds of men learn. He did not fall. He flailed. He made a show of being brave and upright and helpful, and in making the show, he stepped away from the one spot where a person could be useful. "Gate," Sam said softly, not because he wanted it closed or open, but because he was a man who called the name of the thing that mattered like a prayer. Judith kept her hand steady. She was not the water, she was the scribe of it. She wrote what the creek would consent to read. Under the surface, the pond's black coin broke and broke, a shape rose and turned and did not rise again. The rain briefly lightened, as if satisfied with its work. Ruth set down her basket slowly and took 3 steps. Her body was an answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. Yaya belayed, breathed, belayed some more. Judith heard, more than she saw, the moment when the struggle ended. It was a thinning of noise. It was the absence of a thrashing her body had been unconsciously braced to feel through the boards and soil. The pond went on, as indifferent as the morning's first swallow of wheel teeth had been to the day's aches and triumphs. The yard, which had been watching the weather, understood without appearing to understand. Liza banged a pot lid and shouted at a boy to fetch more wood. The boy ran with the look of someone running from nothing much at all. A woman at the spring poured water slowly as if her mind were elsewhere, which it was. The world contorted itself into a shape that could survive the next 10 minutes.
The Yellow Handkerchief Man made noise enough for a lamentation. He gambled toward the water again, then back, then forward, producing and pocketing a handkerchief that stiffened in the rain like a flag too proud to droop. "Help!" he shouted toward the cookhouse, toward the trees, toward the portion of the sky that perhaps housed a god who preferred gentlemen. He's... He did not say drowned. The word was a door that, if opened, could not be closed. He said instead, gone, which is a child's word and a true one. Judith unhooked the rope with hands that did not shake. She set the gate at a careful angle that would not read as recently touched. She stepped back the way a person steps back from a fence they had been leaning on idly while thinking of something else. Wexley's wife came to the porch in a spray of white fabric and a scream shaped like his name. The scream scudded across the pond and landed nowhere, as such screams do. Men began to move as if motion were prayer. Someone with a pike pole appeared from nowhere, which told Judith the plans other than hers had always existed in this yard. Plans for what to do when the master met the world's teeth. Yaya's face when he looked at Judith held joy like coal held fire. Then he banked it. They were not done. They had only crossed one river. "Judith," Liza called, a normal call, full of useful disrespect. "Your hands! Bring 'em to me!" Judith went to the cookhouse. The heat hit her in the face with its familiar slap. Liza thrust a bowl at her. "Stir," she said, like any other evening at any other dusk. "Stir until it coats the back of the spoon." Outside, the pond altered its story for whomever would listen. Inside, milk obediently thickened. Judith's hands did what they knew. Her mind stood in the doorway between rooms. Before midnight, the yard had a new arrangement. Men with lanterns laid poles across the skiff and dragged a shape to shore and covered it poorly. Someone's prayer fumbled and found itself. The doctor from town came, late and sullen, and pronounced a word out loud that the Yellow Handkerchief Man flinched from as if it would climb into his ears. "Drowned," the doctor said, and signed a paper softly, his pride punctured by the wetness of the night. No one asked Judith what she had seen. She was a pair of hands. She was a shadow near the sluice. She went to her pallet and lay down and stared at a knot in the ceiling until it crawled into her dreams and became the ratchet of the gate. In the morning, the birds continued. The sun put its mouth to the world and drank a little. The wheel was still. The house wore its grief like a costume bought on short notice and ill-fitting. Judith washed at the spring and watched the water go where it always went. She wanted to feel triumph. What she felt was steadier and more frightening, responsibility settling like a wet cloak and then warming to her shoulders as if it belonged there. She had written something. The creek had read it. Now there would be footnotes, consequences with their own small fonts and sharp little daggers of reference to painful places. Ruth sat beside her on the log, holding 2 cups that weren't cups, just the bottoms of broken bottles sanded soft by sand and time. She handed Judith one. "Drink," she said. "You look like somebody who's not thirsty but needs to train her throat to swallow what's next." "What's next?" she repeated, as if the words themselves could tell her something. What's next is a reading of the yard, of the people, of the men from town, of Mrs. Wexley's mind, of the driver's ambition, of whether the Yellow Handkerchief Man knows how to spell revenge. Ruth snorted softly. "He can sound it out, but he will bite his tongue on the V. Men like that always do." Judith breathed. The plan, which had been a single act, opened like a map to reveal roads and small lanes and footpaths you could only see if you knew where to look. Leadership, a word she had never been permitted to think alongside her own bones, put its hand in hers like a shy child, asking if it could walk a little way with her. By noon, the driver had gathered everyone in the yard and was shouting instructions that had the shape of order and the substance of panic.
He barked, "Nobody goes near the pond," which was funny because the pond went near everybody, whether they went near it or not. "Nobody touches nothing unless I say, you hear?" He looked at Judith when he said nobody, and at Yaya when he said nothing. "Yard still needs to eat," Liza said, stepping into his wind like a ship, showing it knew more than he did about how to move. "You want to run the mill, you run the mill. You want to stop it, you stop it. My fire is my business." The driver did not repeat himself to Liza, which was smart. He looked at Judith again, then away, as if her eyes were the bright side of a spoon he couldn't stand to see himself in. The overseer from the neighboring plantation came mid-afternoon, as if a body in your yard meant you should borrow authority from your neighbor, the way some folks borrow sugar. He had the whiskery jaw of a man who could not trust his own mouth without fencing it, and he carried a horsewhip because his hand felt wrong without it. He sniffed around the sluice and the bank and the posts and the rope that to his eye was any rope. He prodded the mud with the toe of his boot and made small, masculine, contented noises as if he had found in the texture of wet ground the confirmation of a truth he could narrate confidently later when men wanted to be told what they already believed. "Slipped," he said finally, to the driver and to the yellow handkerchief man and to the doctor from town who had returned to stand near the smell of important men and thereby be a little important himself. "Slipped and fell. Fell so hard he couldn't name north." The yellow handkerchief man swallowed and nodded and wiped his damp neck. He would be back, Judith knew, with his curiosity like a fox nosing in a door, but for now he was grateful to be given a story that asked nothing of him but agreement. When evening came, the yard's breath lengthened. Judith stood again at the sluice, this time to open it for a brief airing while nobody was looking. The wheel turned as if the previous night had been just a different kind of wind. She closed it again carefully, and the ratchet said amen. In the quarters, where conversation could be risked, Yaya sat with his back to the wall and his legs stuck out and his hands palm up in a posture that said, "I am too tired to pretend I am not." "You wrote clean," he said softly to Judith. "The creek read you like a man." Judith laughed with no joy and much tenderness for him. The creek reads what is given. If a man writes foolish, the creek reads foolish. If a woman writes careful, the creek reads careful. Ruth ran her thumb along Judith's wrist where the rope burn had not quite broken skin. "You will scar," she observed. "You will have a letter there that you won't be able to sand down."
"A good letter," Judith said. She looked at her wrist with the kind of love you feel for a child who has done something you taught them but a little too well. J for Judith. Or G for gate. Or L for lead, Ruth said in her dry way. In the days that followed, the plantation changed shape the way a room does when someone moves the table an inch and suddenly the whole house feels cocked. Mrs. Wexley wore her grief like a new dress she was proud to be seen in. She walked the porch with the hymn book she did not open. She sent a boy to town for veils. She sent another boy to the edge of the burying ground and then sent him back with a scream when she remembered which burying ground was hers and which was not. The driver took to walking with a new tilt, as if stepping into the space a dead man makes requires choreography. He yelled less and spoke more, which was dangerous. Yaya watched him the way a man watches a snake in tall grass, not frightened exactly, but honest about what he doesn't want to step on. The yellow handkerchief man returned 3 times in a week and then did not come for 2. Each time he came, he asked questions that pretended to be about the weather. Each time he went, he carried away a story that satisfied him the way cheap liquor satisfies a thirst without nourishing the blood. Judith understood in her bones that he would be back with a different thirst. Meanwhile, the mill required hands. The wheel does not mourn. Flour does not grieve. Judith put her palm to the lever each dawn and felt the pond push back and thought, this is what a life is, pressure and counterpressure, pushing and being pushed until the thing you are moving moves and the thing you are becomes what can move it. It was in this press that leadership continued to sidle up to her, not with trumpets, not with a sash, but with errands that had kernels inside kernels like rice. Liza sent her to the neighboring quarters with a jar of yeast under a cloth and said, I hear theirs died. Be neighborly. Ruth asked her to carry a folded scrap to a woman upriver who had a brother who had a friend who worked nights away from the man who owned him. Sam asked her to look at the tailgate, which had developed a sulk, and to say what it wanted so it would unsulk. Judith did these things. She did not feel brave. She felt like a person who had once stood up inside a room and was now unwilling to sit down again even when the chair looked soft. On the seventh day, a small boat came by way of the marsh creek, hugging the reeds to avoid the gaze of people who liked to have gazes. It bumped the skiff and whispered its arrival against wood. A boy no older than 12 sat in the stern. A woman not yet 30 pulled the oars. She had eyes like a hawk that had learned to wear a bonnet. She looked at Judith and saw her, the way some trees see the wind. "Name Judith?" the woman asked. "Yes," Judith said, because there was no safety in lying to a person who had rode into danger on purpose. "I come from where you sent the yeast, from where the letter went and came back as word of mouth because paper walked slower than a woman who wants to be useful. I come to say there is a man upriver who listens after dark to men in white talk about things they should not talk about where water can hear. He says they think your master drowned himself with his vanity. He says they think rain is evidence and mud is scripture. He says they will not look for a writer where they have never believed a book could be." The relief that moved through Judith then was so huge it made room for terror afterward. If they did not suspect, for now, they could be sloppy with caution. Sloppiness would get people dead. Relief is a narcotic. Judith took one small sip and handed the cup back to the day. "What's your name?" she asked the woman. "Cindy. Short for Lucinda if you're feeling formal. Short for Sin if you're mean." Judith smiled with her eyes. "Cindy," she said. "You hungry?" "Always," Cindy said. "But I can eat later. Now I can carry a thing. You got another letter or a tool or a name?" Judith thought of the map unfurling. She thought of leadership, of how it asks you to speak and then to be silent and to know which is which. "Carry this," she said finally, and leaned in close and told Cindy what no paper should hold. That night, the yellow handkerchief man rode up with 2 others and a question on his face that had changed its weight. He had been thirsting, and someone had passed him a different jug. He wanted to drink from Judith now, not because he knew she was well, but because his kind of thirst turns everything into a cup. "Girl," he said without greeting, and let his horse dance a little as if his wrists had their own conversation with reins. "Where were you on the night Mr. Wexley fell in?" The yard paused the way a sentence does when the writer considers a comma. "I wiped my hands on my apron and lifted my eyes to the level of his chin. I saw rain," she said, which was a poem and a fact. "You see him?" "I saw rain," she said, which was a poem and a fact. "You see anybody near him?" "I saw Mrs. Wexley on the porch. I saw Sam's fire. I saw my own hands." The man leaned forward another inch, and the horse leaned away from the smell of him. "You didn't see a struggle?" Judith tilted her head, as if reading a word she almost knew. "I saw rain," she repeated, and the men behind him shifted because they too had seen rain. It had made their hats heavy and their tempers slight. It had taken their tracks and taught them humility. The man smiled then, the smile of a person who believes he has found a wall where there is a door. "Mind yourself," he said, as if his mind was his to instruct. "We'll be around." He turned the horse too sharply and clucked too hard, and the animal lifted its feet with irritation like a lady raising her skirts. When they were gone, Ruth stood so close to Judith that their sleeves whispered. "You are writing again," she said. "Every word is a letter a man doesn't know is a letter." Judith stared at the pond, which reflected sky and morning and hunger and the possibility of a world with room for her name written by her own hand in daylight. The wheel was still for the night. The frogs were loud enough to be brave for everyone.
In her palate later, sleep did not come like a friend. It came like a debt collector, counting the things it could take if you did not pay attention. Judith lay with her eyes open and saw the map again, and saw at the far edge of it a shape without a name. It had the outline of a boat, and the outline of a whip, and the outline of a paper with a stamp on it, and, strangest of all, the outline of a kitchen table where a woman wrote with the door open. She did not know which shape she would arrive at. She knew only that tomorrow would require a different kind of standing up. Dawn came with a rumor. Men from town were coming with questions shaped like knives. Liza fixed coffee strong enough to make a dead man sit up and apologize. Yaya oiled the hinges on the back door without being asked. Sam tucked a small hammer into his waistband like a talisman he would not use. Ruth braided her hair in a crown that said, "If you try to shame me, I will hand you your shame in a dish." Judith washed, dressed, and went to the sluice. She put her hand on the lever, not to move it, but to greet it. Wood held her hand the way a friend does, without asking for a show. The boat that came was larger than the others, shallow-bottomed, carrying 3 men in coats too heavy for the hour. They wore badges like small suns that had mistaken themselves for stars. The yellow handkerchief man sat in the bow, smaller now that he had friends whose names matched their hats. He pointed with his chin, which is a way of pointing that keeps a man's hands clean. The men stepped onto the dock with the care of people who do not live where wood rots if you don't love it daily. They spoke to the driver as if they and he were members of a club that met where money met guns. Then they separated like dogs around a chicken yard. One came to the sluice. He was red-haired under his hat, and his eyes had learned to squint at things they did not intend to see. He produced a small notebook and a pencil. Judith tried not to love the pencil. It was sharp. It was, itself, a kind of lever. "Name," he said. "Judith," she answered, and then, because the word felt too naked alone, she said "May," and watched his pencil expectant above the page until he grunted, satisfied with the addition of a word he could place. May being, to his mind, a surname he could file. "You were here." "Yes." "What did you see?" "Rain," Judith said, and waited. He looked up, eyebrows frankly amused. "Everybody sees rain," he said. "Give me something I can write without feeling like a fool." Judith tasted the danger and the power balanced on his pencil tip. She let him wait. She made him wait long enough for him to feel the weight in his gut, then said, "I saw the water take what it always takes when a man leans too far over it. I saw the bank do what it always does when rain softens it. I saw the wheel stop because I told it to stop, because that is my work, and no man in town will do it for me." He blinked. He wrote something that did not capture what she had said, but filled a line on his paper. "You tell the wheel what to do," he said, with a skepticism that had in it, to his own surprise, a chip of respect. He looked at her hands. He had been a boy once who loved tools. He had been taught to put that love away. He had not quite succeeded. "Yes," Judith said simply. He grunted again, this time like a man learning a new fact about a piece of equipment he had taken for granted. "You've got a knack," he said, echoed from Wexley's mouth but turned sideways, the difference between sneer and recognition measured in the angle of a phrase. The interview wandered and then folded itself neatly. The man made notes he would later present as observations. The yellow handkerchief man smirked at the margin of everything. The driver nodded like a man nodding for his supper. When they were done, they left the way they had come, water doing the labor of their leaving. "Judith," Ruth said that evening, "will you read?" She held out a scrap wrapped in cloth. It was damp with care. She unwrapped it and saw in a handwriting she now recognized as Cindy's 4 words, "Hush now, build ladder." Judith laughed out loud and the sound startled her into tenderness for her own throat. "A ladder," she said. "Of what?" "Rope," Ruth said without hesitation. "Words, courage, bread, people."
"Of people," Judith repeated, and the map showed her a path she had not noticed because she had been watching the water too close. a path that ran not around the pond, but around the house and out through the pine woods and past the places where men counted things and stamped papers, all the way to a horizon she had been tricked into thinking was a wall. It would take nights of planning and days of pretending. It would take letters no one would write because the letters would be in hands and in the slant of shoulders and in the timing of a pot lid. It would take saying yes to fear and no to the comfort of being only a pair of hands. "Tomorrow," Judith said. "Tomorrow," Ruth agreed, as if the word were a prayer you say at precisely the right temperature so it does not shatter. Judith slept then, not like a person without worry, but like a person who has chosen a road and is walking it whether or not the road intends to be kind. She woke into a morning with air like new tin. The wheel turned and turned, obedient as always. The creek laughed in its throat. Judith put her palm to the lever and felt the pond's familiar pushback, and she thought, "Today, I will ask the wheel to do something it has never done, and I will ask people to do what they have always wanted to do." She turned. Liza stood in the cookhouse door wiping her hands. "Come taste," Liza said, and Judith went, because tasting was part of leading too, knowing when to add salt and when the stew will forgive you if you don't. They ate standing up, spoons clicking against tin in a rhythm that said, "We are alive." Judith told Yaya, quietly, what Cindy had asked and what Ruth had answered. Yaya nodded, rolled his shoulders, and said, "Ladders need stiles." He meant strength. He meant posts you can trust not to split when weight is on them. Sam is a stile. Liza is one. Ruth is one. You are one. She stopped, not out of false modesty, but out of the newness of saying "I" in a sentence like that. "You are one," Yaya said, saving her the trouble of pretending he didn't know. Before noon, Judith had moved 3 sacks of meal no one had asked her to move, and spoken 8 sentences that sounded like ordinary speech but were in fact lines in a poem only certain ears could hear. She had placed a hammer under the lip of the second stair at the back of the big house and tucked a small loaf under the roots of the oak at the bend in the path. She had drawn, with water from the spring, the faintest J on the kitchen door. Nothing a white eye would register, everything a frightened woman could touch with her fingertips and feel steadied by. At dusk, the hour when water forgives and hides, the hour when the pond turns to a careful mirror again, Judith walked to the sluice with a coil of rope she did not need for the gate. Yaya walked beside her, whistling a nothing tune. Ruth came behind with a basket full this time. Bread, 2 onions, a small wrapped triangle of salt, a folded scrap with shapes on it written in water so that they would show only to hands that needed them. From the porch, Mrs. Wexley watched the yard like a person looking into a drawer she keeps meaning to organize. Her veil hung off the back of her hat like a tire without its wheel. The driver stood at the bottom of the steps trying to grow into a new kind of hat entirely. The yellow handkerchief man was nowhere, which did not comfort Judith. Men like that were sometimes most dangerous when they were not in the yard. "Ready?" Ruth asked without moving her lips. "Ready," Judith said, and meant the lever and the ladder and the letter that was her name and the pond and the sky and the hour and the road. She pulled, and the rain that had not decided whether to fall sharpened its mind.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. And fell, not the timid patter of a child asking permission, but a sure-bellied downpour that stitched the pond and yard and roof into one damp cloth. Judith's hand, already firm on the lever, did not flinch. The gate listened. The race obeyed. The wheel leaned into the night's new weight with a low, contented groan, as if the world itself were a mill that had finally found the measure of its grain. Liza's lamp in the cookhouse drew a brief halo, then went humble behind the rain's veil. Yaya's whistle, as faint as thread, unspooled and cut off. Ruth's basket shifted from one hip to the other, the language of readiness in a woman whose wrists could have been mistaken for slender had someone not watched those same wrists lift a pot no man had ever volunteered to carry. "Now," Judith said, which meant not noise, but motion. Not panic, but choreography. She was not giving an order, she was reading aloud what the air and water had already written. Dusk, rain, wheel, pond, backs turned, eyes narrowed, a thin line of path through the pine where the night consented to be split in two. The latter was not wood, it was people. First rung, Sam stepped into the doorway of the mill and coughed his rattle of a cough, the one that had taught boys to scatter and men to pretend they had been planning to move anyway. He slipped the tailgate a hair with his hip so the race's song deepened. The new note was a cover. If anyone looked toward the water, they would see only the water more than itself. Second rung. Ruth went to the big house's back steps with a basket that suddenly needed returning. She left the small hammer under the second stair and the folded scrap in the crack of the banister, shapes written in water that hands needing them would feel before eyes would see. Third rung. Yaya, with the rope around his chest like a sash and his hat pulled low, drifted past the quarter's edge and touched 3 doors in passing. Light touches that made no sound and woke precisely the people who woke easy and stayed sleeping the mouths that talk when they shouldn't. Fourth rung. Liza lifted her pot lid and let the smell of onions and fat and pepper speak a short sermon. It told the yard that supper would keep. It told the driver's belly to mind itself. It told the children to put their noses in bowls and their questions aside. Judith stood at the sluice and watched the rain thicken. The pond, obedient to gravity, offered itself to the opening she had measured with the muscle memory of a body that had learned long ago how to ask and how not to beg. She could feel through the lever the press of the water as a living palm, no malice, no mercy, only that ancient intention water has, to go on. She turned to the path. The first 3 women came wordless. The first had a baby tied so close to her chest that the rain had to argue with her bones to find it. The second had a bundle that was not clothes, but bread and a small tin of lard and a flint wrapped in a rag that had once been a man's shirt. The third had nothing visible and everything necessary. Eyes that had memorized the shape of the yard in darkness, the patience to stand still while fear skittered past her ankles like frogs. Step where I step, Judith said, but softly, because the rain already taught that lesson. They moved. Chronology was a tightrope. Judith walked it with the care of a scribe copying a dangerous text, 1 letter at a time, 1 step, 1 breath, 1 glance at the porch where Mrs. Wexley stood like a pale jar with a dark lid, 1 listen for the driver's voice breaking into the rain like a stick. The path accepted them, not as conquerors, not as thieves, but as people finally going where their feet had longed to go since feet were first named. At the oak, the loaf waited, dry in its hollow, the salt sleeping in the niche cut by a lightning strike years before. Ruth's water-written map glimmered when Judith pressed it flat against her chest. The rain coaxed the invisible into the faint lines only fingers could feel. Left at the split pine, right where the ground goes spongy, keep the marsh on your breath but not in your shoes. Behind them, the yard practiced being a yard under a widow's eye. Liza scolded a boy for his posture. Sam banged something heavy against something heavier and swore inventively about it. The driver walked in a circle that looked like doing work to men who measured work the way children measure storms, by what can be pointed at. The first bend brought them to the low fence that pretended to own the line between rice and pine.
Judith put her hand on the top rail and found there, under the slick of rain, Cinny's sign, 2 tiny notches, a little crooked from haste. She wanted to cry for love of a woman she had known only 1 hour, and for whom in another world she would have baked a cake and told the honest story of her day. "Over," she whispered. They went over. The baby did not cry. The baby was a miracle made of fat and will. Its mother had taught it silence with milk and the steady thump of her heart long before tonight. By the time they reached the black gum whose roots looked like knuckles punching up from the dark, 6 became 10. Yaya took the rear because ladders need a hand at the bottom. Ruth drifted among the rungs like a woman crossing a room to fetch a forgotten spoon, there and back, the way only a person can move who has been underestimated into invisibility and trained that invisibility into tool.
At the ditch, deeper than it should have been, dug in haste by men who refused to know what ditch it was for, Judith felt the first wobble in the ladder. A boy of 9, eyes too large in his head, saw the black trickle and made a sound no louder than the word rain spoken into a pillow. His grandmother squeezed his shoulder once. It was enough. They stepped the far bank, and the mud sighed yes. The pine woods took them then, swallowing their shapes the way water takes moonlight and stirs it into something else. The world in there smelled like sap and iron and the sour of old duff waking under wet. The rain softened to a hiss. The frogs ceded the hymn to crickets. The pond's breath became the forest's breath. Judith counted. She did not count people. She counted heartbeats between rungs to feel if the ladder held. Her braid hung heavy down her back. The rope burn on her wrist, which had stung last night like the letter J cut into green bark, warmed and went quiet, as if the skin itself understood it was a word you do not shout in the woods. At a hollow where a tree had fallen long ago and left its ghost in the ferns, they paused because pausing is not the enemy of flight. Foolishness is. Ruth knelt and opened her basket and produced the small triangle of salt like a trick. She touched it to each tongue in turn, a communion that tasted like oceans far away and like the truth that living things need a pinch of what will one day preserve them when they're gone. "Listen," Yaya said. They listened. The path behind them said nothing but rain. The path ahead said a small, stubbled sound, the burr of oarlocks. Judith closed her eyes, and the map in her head lifted and turned so that the river, until now a rumor in the lungs, resolved itself into a shape her hands believed in. "Cinny," Judith whispered to the ferns. A minute later, the marsh grass opened its pinned mouth and the creek's black tongue slid through. Cinny's skiff kissed mud and stayed kissing. The boy in the stern had grown an inch since yesterday in the way children do when asked to carry a thing fear would prefer to carry for them. He did not look at faces. He counted them the way one counts logs thrown into a raft, purely to know when the raft will float. "1 load. Then I go back for more. Tide's got opinions tonight." Her eyes moved over Judith's face and paused at the wrist. "You good?" "I'm good," Judith said. It was not a lie. Good like water took the shape of its container. They loaded 3 and 3 and 2. Mothers first, not because they were women, but because they carried whole worlds that could not be replaced. Cinny's oars found the quiet water. The skiff dissolved into the marsh. The boy's silhouette became a sentence with no words and enormous meaning. The night closed its mouth again. Judith breathed. The next rung waited in the tall grass like a note in a song you had to hit or the song would falter. She turned, counted heads, met eyes. She saw in those eyes not worship, not the error of pretending she was what she was not, but a steady belief she could not betray without tearing the weave she herself had begun. "Next," she said. Behind them, the yard practiced sorrow. The house learned widowhood's choreography. Chairs moved into new positions, curtains adjusted to flatter grief, a visiting minister summoned to bless what could not be blessed and to avoid naming what could. The yellow handkerchief man slept badly and dreamed of muddy hands pulling at his boots, which was unfair of his own mind, because the only hands that had touched him in earnest had always been paid to do so. The driver dreamed of hats. The doctor dreamed of his signature leaking into rain and smearing his importance into an ugly gray. The second load went smooth until it did not. A lantern flared where no lantern should, downriver, at the bend where the magnolia grew a crown too heavy for itself. Judith's mouth filled with metal. She felt her own hand close on the lever, but there was no lever here. Only Cindy's eyes, which did not widen, and Yaya's breath, which did not quicken, and Ruth's whisper that wasn't a word so much as a rest in the musical staff of the night. "Down," Judith said, palm flat. The grass accepted them. The lantern rode a sloppy circle on the water, and then, unsatisfied with its handwriting, went away. Cindy let out a breath that was almost laughter. She said, "Men like that, they shine their light where they want to be seen shining their light." "Next," Judith said again, and the ladder extended toward the river as if it had always been meant to reach that far. 3 trips. 4. On the 5th, the rain went from downpour to a smear. The air breathed like a horse that has finally finished a climb. The frogs remembered themselves and came roaring back. In the yard, a plate broke, and a confederacy of men decided the break meant the world knew how to keep people in their place. In the pines, a child slept and did not fall from Ruth's shoulders.
By the time the last feet left the last path and the last hand slid last from Judith's fingers, the night had turned from an accomplice into a witness. The moon's hem snagged once on a tree and then freed itself. The creek widened into the river, the real river, not the one Judith had carried in her lungs since childhood, but the one made of actual water and indifferent stars. On the far side, somewhere behind blackened trees, there was a road that led not to safety exactly, but to a set of decisions no one on this side had ever been permitted to make. "Go," Judith whispered to Cindy, and Cindy did. The ladder did not disappear when the skiff did. It rerouted. The last rungs were back in the yard where Liza and Sam and even the driver, poor fool, would have to live with the new angle of the furniture. Judith knew what leaving takes from those who stay and what staying owes those who leave. She felt the river's pull and the yard's pull and almost laughed because a woman's body is built to feel 2 opposite tugs at once and not split. Ruth remained, Yaya remained, Judith remained. Leadership is not all departure. Someone had to close the gate without making the closing speak louder than rain. They did it. The wheel rested. The pond remembered what it always remembers, that it had reflected men's faces and women's decisions and the sky's moods, and had not itself been changed by any of it except one night when it had been asked to pronounce a single sentence at the end of a paragraph and had done so cleanly. Dawn came respectful and damp. The yard, as if just waking from a fever, put its feet on the floor and did not yet trust him. Word travels the way heat does through bread, invisibly, making everything inside expand. Men whispered reasons to one another that would not shame them. Women counted silently the missing bowls at breakfast and unfurled into themselves a little pride that tasted like sorrow's salt. Judith washed at the spring and watched the ripple her cup made find the tail race and go strong. Her wrist ached, but it was the ache of a bell rung properly. Ruth touched her shoulder and did not pretend to be formal. "We are not done," Ruth said. "We are not done," Judith echoed. What followed would never fit in a single telling. Too many days, too many small hinge moments that in isolation looked like nothing much, and together remade a map. The driver, finding himself a man between orders and order, tried on voices until one fit, a softer voice than anyone expected. The widow found the grief could be an empire. She ran its ledger with zeal and, to her own surprise, with occasional stabs of humanity which she hid like opium under lace. The yellow handkerchief man returned with men who had guns and men who had words and men who had both, and they asked questions with teeth and wrote answers without ears. Judith learned a new skill, to say the same sentence in 3 ways so that 3 different men would hear 3 different truths, each sufficient to send them home to supper believing themselves full. She learned another, how to ask the wheel to sing louder on nights when whispering had to travel safer than feet. She learned a third, to watch for those who wanted to be helpful because they wanted to be seen being helpful, and to steer their energy into tasks that would keep them busy and far from any actual work. Cindy ferried more than people. She ferried edges of news. Upriver, a woman had learned to write the letter S so well in pie crust that a sheriff ate a message and did not know it. Downriver, a man had hidden 3 children in sacks of oyster shells and taught them to be stoned for an hour. In town, a preacher had said the word justice and then coughed until his deacons guided him off the pulpit into a prayer in which the word did not occur. Judith made the mill her post. It was where she could see the yard as a page and read it. Who moved toward whom? Which shadows hung too long by which wall? Which combinations of faces meant danger like vinegar poured into milk? She made the wheel her instrument and the sluice her signature. Men from town who had once come to be charmed by Mr. Wexley came instead to be reassured by routine. Judith reassured them with the implacable motion of water domesticated, only a little, by human insistence. It was almost enough. If the world were only the yard and the river and the stretch of pine between, it might have been enough. But the world, like a letter that cannot exist without the letters beside it, insisted on its neighboring lines. Trouble, whose shadow had been sowing all along, stood up and demanded to be read. It came one afternoon dressed as a favor. A man in a good coat, the color of dust, arrived with a boy who wore a hat too big and tried to believe it one day would fit. He had leisure. He had the careful smile of someone promising only what he could deliver, which was a kind of harm that disguised itself as ethics. He was the attorney for the estate, and there would be inventories and valuations and a sale when the weather permitted. He had nothing against anybody. He had againstness itself ironed out of him like a wrinkle.
Judith stood by the lever and felt the pond hold her palm. She recognized a new kind of danger. Not heat, but cold. Not noise, but the quiet of a knife under a napkin. The attorney would not whip a man. He would sell him. He would not accuse a woman. He would itemize her. His handwriting would be a kind of whip that left no welt, but bled people out just the same. Ruth watched him too. Later, in the shade under the kitchen eaves, she said, "Knives like that want to cut something every day, or they start to go dull and scared." "What do we do?" Judith asked, not because she did not have ideas, but because leadership had taught her to say the question out loud so other heads might break it down into more sensible pieces. "Be busy," Liza said, passing with a pan. "Busy is a language men like that don't know how to read. They understand bustle. They do not understand purpose. Show bustle, hide purpose." "Make him tea," Yahya suggested, dead serious. "Men who are fed and warmed forget what paper told them to remember." Cindy, who appeared at odd hours now like a weather pattern the yard had learned to welcome, said, "Steal his pencil." Everyone looked at her. She shrugged. "It will not save a man, but it will make that man reach into his pocket and feel foolish. A foolish man writes worse." They did not steal his pencil. They stole his time. Judith made a small ceremony of showing him the mill. She explained the process to him that he would not use, a history he would not care for, and a set of terms he could repeat later to prove he had been thorough. She used long sentences to slow his short ones. She told the truth and folded other truths into it like egg whites, invisible but structural. Meanwhile, Ruth counted. Liza packed. Yahya arranged an accident, a cartwheel off its pin that required 4 men to lean their backs and say the word heave in a way that would later make them feel they had done something grand. Sam invented a memory of Mr. Wexley that took 20 minutes to tell and made the attorney respect a man he would have otherwise filed under nuisance. By dusk, 3 families had gone by the pine path. The attorney, scratching at his neck where the humidity had settled its hand, declared himself satisfied for now. He left a list with the driver. The list did not include all the names it should have. It included some names twice, as if he could appease fate with abundance. Judith did not tear it up. She learned it. She wrote it on the underside of her skull and then added the names the attorney did not know how to see. The sale came all the same. A month of rain, a fortnight of sun, a week of rumors, then the day pasted to the yard as crudely as any notice nailed to a post. A ring of men in hats, a row of women pretending to be plates on a sideboard, a child counted like spoons. Not today, Judith told her body. You do not break today. She did not break. She bent, gorgeous and exact, around the work the day demanded, loosening, as if by accident, the strap on a mule so it bolted at the right moment, throwing the ring into laughter and then irritation and then disarray. Knocking with her hip the lid off a pot so that scalding steam made a self-important man leap back and curse, thereby scandalizing the minister's wife, which pleased her, which made her speak to the wife beside her, which started a gossip that lasted long enough for Ruth to press a paper-wrapped flint into a boy's hand and sent him toward the marsh with a woman who did not look like a person who could walk fast and could, in fact, outwalk God if walking saved someone's skin. The attorney wrote. His pencil did not break, his ledger did not smudge, but he miscounted. Not numbers, faces. He miscounted as a man does who has learned that people are columns. He learned something else by supper, that columns can topple without warning when a woman standing by a wheel leans on a lever he had not known existed in that accounting of his. By twilight, the yard looked like victory and like defeat to different eyes. A man with money thought himself enriched. A woman who had lost a cousin stood still and held herself together with the fine thread of breath. Cinny, somewhere a bend away, counted another set of heads into a church cellar and fed them a stew that tasted like charity, which is to say, like hunger that has been noticed. Judith carried home the weight of people not yet uncounted. Her wrists ached again, and now not with triumph. She lay on her pallet and allowed for the space of 10 breaths sorrow to enter with its cold feet. She let it sit. She said to it, "You are welcome at my table for a short meal, and then you have to leave because I have work." Work returned in the form of a letter without paper. A woman from upriver slipped into the yard on a Monday with laundry rolled tight into a basket that did not require so much hugging. She touched Judith's elbow at the pump. "They are searching the creeks tonight," she said. "Not just looking, searching." The map in Judith's head shivered and resettled. Rivers have moods. Men have patterns. When patterns shift, the person at the lever must choose, keep the gate as it is and hope the old equation holds, or change it fast enough that the water itself believes the new order is the old one and does not buck. "We go wide," Judith said to Cinny, when the sky cleared enough to have a private talk with stars. "Not through the marsh, out to the rice cut, then into the back bayou where the cypress keep their own counsel." "That's war water," Cinny said. "Not to dissuade, but to honor the choice by calling it its right name." "Then we fight polite," Judith said. "We ask, we listen, we do not force." The first night they tried it, the bayou behaved like a proud old man with a new ache, grumbling, testing, then watching with narrowed eyes as the skiff threaded the angled knees of trees older than sadness. The child in the bow, no longer a boy in Judith's mind, but a person with a job, did not breathe for lengths of time that would have frightened an onlooker. Ruth sang under her breath, not a hymn exactly, but the up and down moan of a wheel that has learned a new song and will play it until every tooth knows the melody. Halfway through, a lantern bloomed on the main river, scratchy and sudden. Men's voices, weary with the effort of feeling important, came and went. The bayou shrugged its mossy shoulders and hid the skiff in its hair. Cinny did not move for 7 minutes. Judith counted and did not go mad, because counting was now as natural as breath and as sturdy as oak.
They made it. A church with no name opened its door behind a screen of cane. Inside, the benches smelled like scrubbed pine and old knees. A woman put a cup into Judith's hand and then took it back and filled it properly because she saw what was in Judith's eyes and knew the size of the thirst. When they returned before dawn, the river glittered with the false peace of danger at rest. The yard woke to a day that would soon be described by someone in town as ordinary. Judith learned to put her face into the shape of that word and to carry on her back the exquisite unordinariness of a life remade in inches. Seasons turned. The mill swallowed harvests and spit out winter. The widow wore new black with old grace. The attorney's ledger fattened like a pig and then went lean, because the numbers would not settle, and because a woman with a wheel kept rearranging the arithmetic. There came, finally, a morning with air like tin again, the same taste as the morning when Judith had first said the word ladder. She did not call it omen, she called it weather. But her hands tingled, and the scar on her wrist itched, and when she looked at the pond she saw in it not a mirror, but a page about to be turned. News arrived on that page in the shape of boots. Soldiers, not many, not splendid. Men with dust in the seams of their coats and eyes that had learned to distrust orders that did not come with bread. The war, which had been happening mostly somewhere else, unfolded its map in their shadow right here. They asked for water. They asked for the wheel to stop so they could hear each other. They asked whether there had been trouble and laughed shortly when the answer was no, as if they regretted the lack of a story to write home. One of them looked at Judith the way the red-haired man had, as if she were a piece of equipment someone had forgot to list. "You run this?" he said, without sneer. "I run this," Judith said. He nodded. He did not say anything fine. He adjusted his belt and swallowed, and looked at the pond as if it might offer him back some portion of his old life. It did not. Ponds are not generous that way. He moved on. War peeled time like bark. Some days were sap-sticky and slow. Others went up with a roar and left a char. Through it, the yard learned a strange new equilibrium. Increased danger, increased audacity. The attorney's visits became rarer. The widow became poorer, and in her poverty kinder in ways she would never have predicted and would never name. The yellow handkerchief man went off to make himself useful somewhere else, where usefulness looked more like cruelty and came with medals. Judith's name began to move, not on paper, but in mouths that knew how to hold a word and not drop it. Judith of the Mills, some said, because they needed a surname and liked the way it felt in the mouth. Judith of Water, Ruth said, in a laugh that did not mock. Leadership changed flavor. At first it had been the high of a plan executed clean, the sweetness of a gate obeying, of a rope tight at the exact right second. Then it had been the salt of consequence and the grind of grief into grit. Now it was bread, daily, plain, necessary, risen when there was time, flat when there wasn't, torn with hands, shared, without counting who took more. And then, as simply as a wheel turns because a hand placed itself on a lever, came the reckoning that does not announce itself as such. A boy in a blue coat who had once been a child at a river people had been forbidden to name, came with a paper. Not a ledger, not an inventory, not a sale. A proclamation. Words written by men who had argued and prayed and compromised and bled. Words that rode into yards on boots and were laughed at and were believed and were torn and were stitched back together and were finally allowed to sit on someone's table while a woman cooked. The widow read it. She read it twice because she could not make the words cut the way she had been told they would cut. The driver read it with his lips moving and then with his lips still. The attorney was not there to read it into a shape that would benefit him. Ruth held it. She did not kiss it. She was not a woman to kiss paper. She folded it, not reverent, not careless. She put it under the edge of a plate and set a spoon on top of the plate and looked at Judith, and then at the door, and then at the wheel, and then at the path, and then at the pond. "What does it mean?" a boy asked in a voice that had changed since last summer but had not yet found its bottom. "It means that some men said a thing out loud that God wrote a long time ago. It means some men will pretend they did not say it. It means work. It means," Ruth added, "that the lever has moved." Judith stood and felt the pond under her hand as if across a distance. Her body ran through a catalog of anticipations and found itself oddly still at the end of it. It means we keep reading and writing, but now we can sign our names if we wish. She did. Not that day. There was too much bustle to hide and too much purpose to show. But the day after, in the mill on a scrap of paper that once wrapped a hunk of salt pork, she wrote Judith in a careful line. Then she wrote M.A. Because a woman gets to choose how she is known when the choice is suddenly hers, and sometimes the words your mother sang are the ones you want the world to use when it says you. It was not triumph that lifted her hand at the end of the second line. It was exactly what had lifted it on the night a man leaned too far over a pond and found he had pushed his luck into water. Responsibility. The kind that wakens you early for love of the wheel and sends you to bed late for fear of the ledger, and that, finally, asks you to go to the church with no name and sit at a table where children whose feet now touched the floor ate stew without first looking to see who else would be allowed a bowl.
Years. Countable now, not merely survivable. Washed the yard clean and dirty it again. The mill turned. The pond remembered. The pine woods grew and shed. The church changed its roof. Cindy's hair went gray in streaks that struck her as becoming. Yahya's patience turned into a garden that gave fat beans and forgiveness. Ruth taught a class in a room behind the kitchen where the widow, pray for her, pretended not to know what the woman she paid for laundry and soups did with a dozen children in the hour before supper. Liza sat sometimes, finally, and put her feet up, and told a story with her eyes closed and her hands still. Judith of Savannah, people said, when they needed to place her on a map. Judith of the mill, when they thanked her for the flour that rose bread on tables where a father, newly clumsy with gentleness, apologized for a thing he could not name. Judith of water, when a woman far downriver taught a girl to set a gate by feel and said the name as if it were a blessing. She went back to the pond at dusk sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but for the particular privacy dusk gives honest memory. The pond would have told the story differently, she knew. It would have said, "A woman asked and I obliged, then I went on." Judith's account included the names of people and the smell of rain and the sound of a ratchet's teeth and the long, slow way a yard can change its mind. On an evening like the first, the old cypress snag made a black fist. Dragonflies wrote green lightning over the water. The wheel made its slow vow. Ruth came to stand beside her with a cup that was too full and did not spill. They did not speak for a while. "Do you ever think about that night?" Ruth asked at last. "I think about the rain," Judith said. "I think about the rope. I think about the moment after, when everything looked exactly the same across the water and was not." "And him?" Judith let the question stand between them like a post you tie a good boat to. "I think about a man who loved his reflection. I think about a woman who loved the lever more. I think about how water does just as slow, and sometimes it needs a hand to help it pronounce a sentence." Ruth nodded. "And I think about letters," she said, smiling in the dark. "How dangerous they are, how beautiful, how like gates." At the church with no name, a chalkboard hung now on a nail. On it, someone had written a word in an unsteady, immense hand. D-I-G-N-I-T-Y. Underneath, small practice letters corrected the spacing but did not erase the first attempt. Judith ran her finger across the board and left a fresh squeak, an announcement of presence as humble and as exact as any signature. She kept the mill. She taught others its grammar and stepped back so that shorter hands could reach without climbing. She learned to read aloud in a voice so plain it could draw tears down the face of a woman who had known 200 recipes for rice but had never believed a book could be a tool the way a spoon was. She married if she wished or did not. She kept her own counsel. She stood for people at tables where men now asked for her opinion and learned the felt sense of the moment when opinion becomes instruction and instruction becomes a lever you must manage carefully lest you turn the wheel wrong. Sometimes, when storms came from a certain quarter, the pond would jump its banks and run into the yard like a guest who had drunk from the wrong jug and forgotten his hat. Judith would step into her old stance, hip against wood, palm on lever, feet talking to mud, and the world would make sense again in the old good way. Ask, feel, answer, check, turn, listen, quiet, turn. She never told the whole story in one sitting. She did not need to. The yard told it. The people who had left told it back from other places with other water. The attorney told a pruned version in a town where men believed they were listening to news and were, in fact, hearing the sound of their own maps being redrawn a little underfoot. And the pond, when pressed, would only offer the same comment it had always made about human things. It holds a mirror, and it swallows, and if you lean too far, it will take your hat and sometimes your breath. And if a woman stands at a lever with her palm steady and her eyes clear, it will help her write a single sentence the world will spend years learning to read. Judith, walking home from the mill one evening when the air smelled like lightning left unfinished, paused at the burying ground behind the mill. The stones that marked her mother's place had shifted under summers and settled under winters. She righted them with the tenderness you give a letter that has begun to curl. She traced M-A-E in the damp grit on the foremost stone and said, as she had said 1,000 times, "I did not drown. I learned to make water speak." From the big house, laughter drifted, not cruel now, merely human and perhaps still self-satisfied. From the quarters, a fiddle picked up a tune the minister would have preferred it did not know. From the church, the chalkboard's faint squeak wrote another word. From the river, Cindy's oarlocks, old friends, croaked their rusty blessing. Judith lifted her face to the last light. The world was not what it should be. It was more human than any paper could hold. It was a page still being written on by stubborn, ordinary hands. She loved it with the same practical love with which she loved ropes that did not fray, soup that did not scald, people who did not break if you leaned on them in the rain. She went back to the mill and put her palm on the lever. The wood had worn to fit her hand and the hands of those she had taught. She leaned. The gate answered the old instruction, and the wheel, obedient and new as the first day she believed it could be hers to command, said yes.